from Australia. Hello, Alice. Can you hear us?
Online.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, everybody.
Hello,
Hi.
Alice.
Hi, Elise. Lovely to see you.
Really,
Oh,
really-
it's so nice to see you too, Sarah. How are you?
Very good.
We are
Let me
doing
face
well.
the camera. Hi, Elise.
Hi,
Thank you so
everybody.
much, Alice, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Time. I know it's holiday in Australia right now. Like you are going somewhere with your family.
Yes, but then I just couldn't bear the thought of missing out of talking to people here. So thank you for the invite.
No problem. It's such
Sarah,
a
do you want, I can wait a bit. You don't, if you want to finish, I don't want to sort of,
Not at
yeah,
all. Not at
Yeah.
all. This is
make
an
you have to.
ongoing thing. I think we would like to hear from you and then continue our conversation. We are going to continue this for 3 days.
Yeah, Sarat will be here. So he's available for 3 days. So no worries about that. Yeah, but your time is also unconditionally. Right. So, okay, Alice, do you have any presentation you want to show us or you will just...
I have a few slides, but they're not
Okay.
like, there's a few slides,
Sure.
but yeah.
And I think this is also like, what time is it? Like 11 right now? Yeah, cool.
It's 11 to you, right? Yeah.
Just right on the time. Thank you. Floor is yours.
But
Alice.
did folks need to have a tea break or something? I feel like just in case have people had a break?
Oh, they already have it.
It's okay.
Yeah,
All
it's
right.
just a very, very good timing for us to listen for you. Okay, go ahead, Alice.
Okay, well, hi everybody. Thank you, Yanu, and all the organizers for inviting me. My name's Elise Klein. I'm an associate professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. And I'm calling you on unceded and sovereign lands of the Ngunnawal, which others would know as, or it's near Canberra in the Australian Capital Territory. I don't actually know, so I hope this all makes sense because I'm not actually sure what sort of order I'm speaking in the sort of scheme of the whole sort of training. So my apologies if this doesn't sort of sit with where everyone else is or what you've all been talking about so far. But I guess maybe if you hear if I share a little bit of my presentation, and then maybe we can have some discussion and some questions. I'm also the co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab here in Australia with my wonderful colleagues Ben Spies-Butcher and Troy Henderson. And so basic income is an extremely wonderful, hopeful, and critical, I think, intervention in thinking about futures here in the settler colony of Australia and elsewhere. And it's because of how important the idea of basic income is. Thinking about what this policy area means in a settler colony such as Australia is really critical. I think getting that right and thinking about, what it means for a space that has contested sovereignties, a space in which colonization has never ended here. And I know we're neighbours, but on the screen you have often a map of Australia that doesn't get shown enough. And this is the many nations, many sovereignties that have been here since time immemorial. You can see in the small map is what people most think about Australia or most understand of Australia. But that is what, when the British arrived here, came to a place of deep history, sophisticated economies and societies, and sovereignty already here. So thinking about that, and where I want to sort of talk about is, what does it mean to think about a universal basic income in a space of colonization? What does universality mean? And claims of rights, universal rights mean when some people have been taken, things have been taken from some more than others. And we're talking about the expropriation of land, life and labor of First Nations people in the maintenance, in the establishment and the maintenance of the Australian, the settler Australian state and economy. So it's that tension that I'm thinking about basic income. What does universality mean when you have this ongoing process of colonization? And I think this draws out bigger questions for scholars and activists in the basic income space, thinking about questions of global basic income and distribution globally, given that the global economy has been set up through and only possible through the expropriation of peoples that were colonized, but also peoples subjected to plantation slavery, indentured labor, and other regimes of expropriation of labor. That's very, very important to understand the global economy. And so questions of universality is really important, and questions of distribution is really important for thinking about justice and basic income. So I guess the research that I've been sort of spending time is I've written a bit with, quite a bit with Dr. Liz Folksman, who's at King's College in England, right in the belly of the beast. And we've been thinking about and being concerned with these questions of coloniality and how often they're not adequately, in our opinion, addressed in a lot of basic income thinking. A lot of the time, we just don't talk about it. So thinking about different ways in which coloniality can come up. And particularly also you see it, I'm going to talk about distribution, but you also see it in the way in which we even understand or measure and set up experiments of basic income. There's really important questions of coloniality that play out in standards, in measures, in who gets to measure who. These are all very important questions that need to be thought about when we're thinking about basic income. I always say to my students that, you know, just because you say you're doing good, you need to sort of interrogate also the kinds of impacts that has on people, even if you have the best intentions, of course. So so the paper that I have here is really acknowledging that a lot of basic income scholarship has done a fantastic job and has a very deep analysis of class inequalities and really gender inequalities produced through capitalism, but less of a focus on racial and colonial inequalities, what Aileen Moreton Robinson calls the race war of modernity, or what Glenn Coulthard calls, drawing on David Harvey, calls colonial accumulation by dispossession. And like I said, this is critical because racial capitalism scholars understand that all capitalism is racial capitalism, because accumulation requires, as articulated by Jody Malamede, quote, the loss, disposability, and the unequal differentiation of human value, and racism enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires. Coloniality and capitalism are thus inherently linked. And here in settler colonial Australia, for example, and that's the example that I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking with you about, the economic base of the economy is the expropriation of land, the extraction, land stolen from First Nations people, has been fundamental to the historic and ongoing dispossession of, what people understand as, the economy of Australia. that ongoing dispossession and that ongoing denial of sovereignty is fundamental to the ability for the economy here to function. So that matters, and thinking about race and coloniality when it comes to basic income matters because, as I've already sort of sketched, even when framed as rights enhancing, and sort of talking about rights, basic income as enhancing human rights, which is of course super important. But unwittingly, if we don't think about structures of racial inequality and coloniality, they can be reinforced. So I want to suggest that thinking about how reparations and having a kind of reparative way of thinking might be able to help us, scholars, activists of basic income, do a bit better when it comes to questions of coloniality. And something I'll return to towards the end of the talk. So first of all, I want to just tell you a little bit about this place, what gets called Australia. So the welfare state of Australia has for a long time been held up as a crown in the jewel of Australia's modernity. But it's also really critical to think about how Australia is not just a welfare state, but is an ongoing colonial state, and how the two, the welfare state and the colonial state, are inherently linked here, historically and ongoing. So the foundation of Australia, what gets called a liberal democracy, rests on the conquest and stealing of land and the attempted elimination of Indigenous people as a way to access the land. So to quote Deborah Bird-Rose, to get in the way of settler colonization, quote, all the native has to do is to stay at home, end quote. So just to show you another map, this map is a map of massacre sites in Australia. So there's different time periods that these massacres occurred over, a good chunk of 200 to 300, 200 years, starting from what gets called Tasmania down the bottom, around Sydney, into the Port Phillip region, which is present-day Victoria, and then more recently then sort of Queensland, and then more recently the Northern Territory, Western Australia. And massacres were really were important for the settlers in terms of clearing out the land and getting rid of First Nations people off the land so the settlers they could take the land. A lot of these massacres we only know about them because they've been passed down in oral history because of the settlers, of course, destroyed and didn't document, of course, their crimes that they were committing. So this project, this map, has been meticulously put together by the late Lyndall Ryan, who has gone through the oral record and has been able to document massacre sites. But, the massacres were just part of the attempts of elimination. That you had also the stolen generation and the stealing of children, the sort of eugenic thinking of what gets trying to sort of, breed out Aboriginality and settle and trying to sort of assimilate children into white society, which has caused awful damage to families who never got to see their children that never got to see their parents again. And then there's been all sorts of other forms of assimilation techniques that the state has continually attempted. Of course, disease, rape, all sorts of forms of violence have been leveled against First Nations people in trying to clear the land for the settler state to be established. And so, you know, the land has been essential for the biggest industries of big and small industries of Australia. Some of the most profitable industries still today require stolen Aboriginal land, extraction, the housing market, agriculture, are extremely important, of course, because they rest on stolen land. But also not just stolen land, but also stolen labour. And there's been a long history. Whilst the focus of settler colonisation is stealing of land, there's a whole lot of stealing of labour. And, you know, the slave trade was absolutely part here. People stole people also from around the islands. And brought them working onto pastoral stations, sugarcane plantations, the pearling industry, and stolen labour. So, but so that's sort of, you know, talking about the establishment of the economy, but part of that also has been feeding into the ability of the Australian settler state to have a welfare state. And I just want to be a bit more explicit about how that happened. And it sort of happened in various stages. But I mean, like earlier, sort of, you know, the foundation, the Federation of Australia was 1901. So all the different British colonies came together in 1901 and called themselves Australia. So from that point, you had sort of a period of really where, you know, the way in which the social security system has always been part of the colonisation of First Nations people. You have the way in which First Nations people were completely excluded from the initial ideas of the social security system. So in 1901, Australia likes to celebrate how it was one of the first to have, you know, social security for parts of the population. If you were white and if you were male, is sort of the general trend in that story. But importantly, it was a time of the White Australia policy, and you had the denial of First Nations people and anyone that was deemed not white excluded completely from that safety net. So in a way, it was kind of an example of reverse affirmative action for white supremacy, where the exclusion of non-white people you know, helped maintain the quality of life for the white population while everyone else was excluded. And First Nations people were absolutely part of that. The post-war period also, it gets often romanticized as sort of the good old days for the welfare state, you know, before the sort of neoliberal turn. But colonisation absolutely was well underway then too. And, you know, First Nations people were excluded from a lot of the social security payments. But instead they were given rations. So to try and get people off their land, part of the process was getting people onto stations and onto missions. And so people would be sort of kept there with rations. And what you can see on the screen are documents of rations from the Kimberley. Some of the more recent in the last sort of 50 years, records of rations in the Kimberley, which is up in the northwest of Australia, on stations. So this is, you know, flour, tea, sugar, keeping people working for the pastoral industry for no payment, but instead for rations. And this was seen as a form of welfare, whilst the welfare state for the white population, of course, was completely something else. And then today, Social Security is, you know, has taken a sort of neoliberal turn, so it's become way more punitive for everybody. and specifically we have these things called mutual obligations. So you can't get Social Security unless you basically perform activities, and it gets called here work for the dole. Super punitive, and it's definitely not basic income. But what's interesting is how those mutual obligations are being used to continue to assimilate First Nations people into settler society. So a real targeting of productive ways that First Nations people work on country, trying to assimilate that into settler ideas of work and settler ideas of productivity. So instead of caring for country, that you have to have a job. And if you don't, then you get targeted by the welfare system in very punitive ways, and you get your money withheld, and you also can get put on this thing called the cashless debit card, which has now changed its name, but at the heart of it was quarantining your money, and restricting what you could spend it on. And so have done quite a lot of research around this, and people say, that quote comes from my research, it's like going back to the ration days. So people can see the ongoing story of colonization, how the welfare state continues to be a colonial presence in their life. So I say all this because, of course, basic income in this context would be a huge improvement, absolutely a huge improvement for everybody, but particularly for First Nations people, in terms of agency, economic security, and distribution, which are all issues that are fundamental questions for us here. Yet there is a tension for basic income scholars in this space, because whilst the universal share of wealth funded by taxation would help redistribute material privilege, including to First Nations people, a universal basic income would not account or recognise for the violence, the displacement of nationhood, the stealing of land, the denial of sovereignty First Nations people have endured over many years and continues to this day, so that the political economy of the settler society and maintaining the welfare state can continue. So this is a real tension for us. It's a real tension for models of basic income that fail to account for ongoing coloniality, the interlinkages between the colonial state and the welfare state, the former financing the latter. And just to note, like, we see this trend globally. Welfare states in the global north are either past colonial states or imperial states. So they've either amassed wealth from colonization and plantation slavery, and then through neo-colonial policies extracting rents from the global south, which all underpin their ability to provide economic security, or the settler or other settler colonial states amassing wealth from stolen country, labor, lives, historically ongoing, and it's ongoing within the global north. So, from the US through to the many Scandinavian countries, including Sweden, which is held up as sort of, one of the best welfare states, but it's a settler colonial state. It's been extracting stolen, it's created its wealth in part from stolen land of the Sami. So this is where I think, it's useful to think with the idea of reparations. And this is sort of my last sort of idea before I'll finish up. I hope that that's okay in terms of time. So what do I mean by reparations? So I'm not talking so much here about one-off payments of compensation, as a sort of price of doing business, if you like, but reparations that are transformative or aim to be transformative of the very colonial relation altogether. This is what Afumi Taiwo has recently called the constructivist view of reparations. They aim to be, drawing on the term by Adhom Gadachu, to remake the world, if you like, reparations that aim to remake the world and transform the structures of domination and dispossession. There's a lot to say here about the long history in the reparations movement that have tried to be in this sort of constructivist space, to try to change relations from, you know, the black movements in the US. There's a long line of reparative demands that, you know, have aimed to completely transform the relation of racial capitalism. There's movements in settler colonial states around land back, which is very important in terms of a reparative act of land back, because of course territory is such a critical part of the settler states' ongoing economy. And so questions around changing the relationship of land from private property to sort of a common sort of relation with country is important. Another important example. But even sort of more recently, the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, you had heads of states, particularly across the global south, that really tried to put reparations on the agenda alongside a whole lot of other changes to the global political economy to change the order of extraction that goes on, the sort of neo-colonial relations in the global economy also. So these were, you know, reparations was a big part of what they were proposing there too. So the reparations demand have sought transformation. The ones that have sought transformation have offered very real ways to unsettle racial capitalism, such as using funds to both redistribute and build anti-capital and anti-colonial movements and arrangements, or like I said, land-based reparations, and the demand of returning of land are just some examples. But also they provide, there's also, you know, part of the reparations, various movements have provided also ways of alternative lifeways and economies beyond capitalism and racial domination. That's something we can talk a bit about too, if that's of interest. We know that basic income alone is never a silver bullet, and it always needs to be considered alongside various other policies for transformation. For example, you know, this has been some really important work that feminists in the basic income movement have done. And, you know, there's been a long-standing debate around, you know, could a universal basic income disproportionately benefit or men who choose to ignore or evade care work responsibilities, for example. So there's a case that's been made by feminists that, you know, we need to think about basic income, but alongside other policies and interventions that redistribute the notion of care completely and re-socialize who does care completely, break down gendered norms that regulate that critical work being done often only by women, for example. So similarly, in that sort of spirit, reparations could be considered alongside our demands for basic income. And this is essential if basic income is pursuing questions of justice, as there's no justice if we do not consider questions of coloniality. So I might just stop there and yeah, maybe we can, I don't know how much time we've got, Yanu, but I'm happy to take questions or whatever you think. Thanks.
Thank you, Elise. Yanu had to step out, so I'm taking Yanu's place. Though I cannot speak Bahasa, we have our colleague here who will do that Bahasa. But I'm really thrilled that you brought this issue and you brought a certain depth to the whole question of basic income, and you located it in the coloniality and racial capitalist context. I think that is something we often miss when we are working with policymakers and we don't articulate the way you have so wonderfully articulated. Thank you so much, Elise, for doing that. And if any of you have any questions comments, please go ahead. This is the time. You have a question? Anybody, any questions? Any comments? You want to say it in Bahasa?
Ini teman-teman ada yang mau menanyakan mengenai UBI ini kepada Elise? Mbak Kompas? Oh iya kan. Mas kita bisa? Ibu? Belum. Oke. Ada lagi teman-teman? Siapa? Belum? Siapa? Oh oke. John.
Hello, Elise. It was a really thought-provoking lecture because I could continuously through the lecture connect to my own Indian context in which caste has been a very central differentiator, and here the colonial apparatus has worked in the style of a Brahmanical patriarchal caste hierarchical fashion. So I was just thinking that there should always be a plus to universal basic income. I think I completely agree with how reparations have the capacity to recognize the historical injustice and bring that element into the political economy. For example, my own experience in work free pilot in Hyderabad in India, and a pilot with transgender persons clearly showed how the current injustice or the current situation is so much linked to the historical, and to undo that or to attempt to undo that, cash by itself is not sufficient, or a basic income with all its 5 principles is not a silver bullet, and it has to be complemented with some other thing. In our case, I felt that the community organizing work or a relational care based, needs based community organizing has helped in bringing that kind of conversations back on the table. For example, I think that the presence of basic income will support the communities in a way that they will have some more free time to organize on these lines, to undo these injustices. In India, for example, I'm sorry, I'm bringing a lot of that context. In India, for example, Dr. Ambedkar, who is seen as a very important figure in the movement of the most marginalized communities, there is a slogan that says, educate, organize, and agitate. So there, the fight really is to say that the most marginalized should be able to also enter into the state power, and then only will be able to make any changes. Otherwise, affirmative action only helping someone to educate themselves or just entering into certain job markets won't make any difference. So in my, I am just concluding, in my experience, I've seen that basic income had opened up the space for community to come together, to tap that community potential, to organize on the lines of this historical injustice and fight it. And similarly, I think in your context, reparation is that that plus element that connects and opens and a closed conversation. Would you like to add anything? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
This
you,
is not
John.
so much a
That's
question, but a
Yeah,
parallel.
no, that gives me a lot to think about. I think, I think like, yeah, I guess maybe so because I come from the sort of social oh no, I'm sort of more, no, it's not, that's not true. Maybe I'll say this, that, you know, I think there's a lot of work that gets done thinking about basic income along the lines of capitalism and exploitation of labor. And then there's, you know, really important work in terms of thinking about basic income and capitalism and the expropriation and free riding on social reproductive labor. There's less work of thinking about the dynamics. So capitalism is also not just market exchange, it's not just labor exploitation, but it's also expropriation. And that's the space of the important role, the awful role that colonization, plantation slavery, genocide has played and plays in the making and the maintenance of the global economy. And I think the question of how do basic income scholars think about expropriation is really important. So I'm reflecting on your sort of thoughts around sort of caste, for example, and expropriation in caste, in a sort of a caste relationship, I think is really important. And yeah, thank you, John. And I didn't actually, I'm so glad you're there. That's wonderful. I didn't get to say thank you also, you and Yanu, for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elise. So good to
Thank
listen.
you. Yeah, any comments?
Yang di dalam ruangan ada yang
Yes.
mau,
ma'am.
Ibu?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not really prepared. Yeah, thanks very much for inspiring presentation for Alice. Yeah, I just thinking, sorry. Yeah, I'm thinking if in Australia, maybe because of the tax deduction also very high, maybe there is a significant capital for implementing the UBI. I'm thinking if how about in Indonesia, for example, at the moment, because Indonesia now we already have a policy that helping people actually to alleviate the poverty in many forms. But I agree with Pak Yan who said this morning, if the government really have a willingness or political will, it can be implemented. But I doubt it. There is no political will from the government, also from the society that we care each other to, in order to help individuals who have what do you call it, who can trap in the poverty, so it won't be successful. But this is very good idea to have UBI. So I just would like to ask from Elise, in the situation like Indonesia, is there anything that we can start off? I mean, how can we really prepare in this condition, especially during this time with economic very hard for Indonesia right now, but the poverty, the percentage of the poverty people, poor people are very high. So I just would like to ask, is there any basic requirement that we have to prepare in order to implement the UBI, if we can learn from Australia? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. It's such a thoughtful one. I really appreciate it. Look, I'll say this. You know, in part, you know, I think the questions around the sort of like you sort of like really spot on when you sort of talk about sort of the ability of the Australian welfare state versus, say, the ability of the Indonesian social protection systems. That's of no mistake of design. And I think that's the sort of the important part of thinking about sort of the history of the global economy, but also the sort of structures of the contemporary global economy and the way in which coloniality plays out in that system. You know, I mean, of course, you have the impacts of Dutch colonization, but then you have, American imperialism and Western imperialism and the structural adjustment, and then you have extraordinary debt, like the questions around the absolutely debilitating impact of debt, what that has meant for global South economies. These are no mistake of design. These are, feeding into a sort of a ongoing sort of neo-colonial relationship in the global economy. So I think the question of reparations there is super important still today, globally. And I think this is an important question for all of us in the basic income space to think about. Is, there are really great work being done in terms of global basic income, but also distribution globally to ensure that. Sorry, can I say that that there's sort of different views on a global basic income? Do you just grow state at the state level? Do you grow social protection schemes or sorry, basic income, a universal basic income within the nation state, or is there a mechanism and then just helping each country to grow their own is great, but there's this issue around unequal exchange, right? Like, why is it? There's also no mistake of design that an Australian basic income, I would be paid more than, say, someone in Mali. And that's because of the global economy in terms of valuation of human life and labor and of sort of these relations that have been set up. It's a concept called unequal exchange. That's an important question for us to think about. Or do we think about a global basic income and questions of redistribution? And that is, there's a reparative element in that in terms of what redistribution looks like globally, is important. So I hope that, I know that's I think these are really important questions for us as scholars as well as activists in terms of what we understand as global justice, and how we change the structures globally to make sure either that it's easier for the state of Indonesia to have a universal basic income, or there's mechanisms globally to redistribute.
Thank you. Thank you, Elise.
One,
Please go ahead.
short
Please go
question, please. Thanks so much for your response. I just and how about the what you call it, the condition, something like a climate change condition? Can you take any consideration that's kind of variable? Because if we are learning from the past, when we have the crisis about the pandemic and so hard hit people. So how about the in this situation, the current situation with the global global climate change? Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the past plays out in the present. I think that's the argument that I'm making, is that I mean, that's the whole demands around the climate justice space, right? Is that those that made the mess, or who are most making the mess, are the ones that have got the most ability to be okay in the climate crisis. And that's the debate of loss and damage, which is, it sort of speaks into the space of reparations, although it's not, there's no reparations, but, at the moment, but it does speak to these questions of reparations and reparative justice for the damage that has been done. And I think this is an opportunity, right, is to think about, these reparations as transformation. How do we remake the world? So these colonial relationships, whether it is ecological crisis, ecological destruction, economic inequalities, and economic insecurity, the questions of reparations demands a remaking of the way in which we relate to our ecologies as much as we relate to each other. It's a great question. Thank you. You actually took the words out of my mouth when you said, how about I think even though there's an ocean between us, there must have been some, like, I don't know.
Telepathy.
Energy, yes.
That was very good. I have one last question from me, Elise. I'm really glad you brought out this question of stealing of labor, stealing of and now stealing of land, stealing of labor, stealing of lives. But I think all that gets invisibilized, all that gets buried, and then a new narrative is created as if nothing has happened in the past, as if nothing is happening now when it comes to gender or any other ways in which injustice is completely embedded into the system. Now, the language that is used is when we introduce the idea of unconditional basic income, the way we are attacked is saying it's a free ride, free money, something for nothing. This is the kind of language that we are attacked with. And for example, even in Indonesia, they have launched a new pilot, a new program for school children. It's called free lunch. I mean, if you believe that children are entitled to nutritious food and that must be given by the system, why do we call it free? So
Yeah.
in India, they have now coined a new term saying that governments are now giving freebies. So how does one deal with it?
Mm. I feel like all the brains in the room will have a much better response to that. Look, I think, we have this concept here, called truth telling, and it's something that Indigenous communities are demanding of settlers to tell the truth about history and how that plays out in the present. And I think that, in a I think it is no mistake of design that people don't know their histories, but they also don't know how the history plays out in the present. And so, when we look at inequality, I mean, there's many parts to that, but a part of it is what I'm talking about in terms of, stolen life, labor, and land, and sort of the role of colonization and genocide and slavery, and then sort of colonization, and so on, debt. And so, how can you talk about free when you can't account for? I mean, I know, it's one of strategy and it's one of communication. I know these are really important topics. Basic income scholars, do a huge amount of work on, but my feeling thinking about the sort of reparation space is needing to tell the story, and about why these rights are important, not just because people are entitled to them, but because their situation has been because others have stolen or have benefited or accumulated advantage of others' accumulation of disadvantage. And I think that is an important story.
Thank you so much. I think you have really set the tone for this 3 day.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful, and thank you everyone for your generous questions and comments. I really appreciate it. I hope our paths cross again very soon.
Bye-bye. Bye,
Thank you.
Elise. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elise.
One big round of claps.
Tepuk tangan dulu.